Your yellow sheet is just to be used to help you figure out which pattern or texture that you would like for your monster project. So I am almost done with filling out all of the textures and patterns, and then I'm going to choose one and create a collagraph stamp from my chosen pattern. And I decided I would just choose a simple polka dot pattern. You'll need some glue, some craft foam, some cardboard, or you could also use foam board. And I'm just going to cut some circles from the foam, the craft foam. Doesn't matter which color you use because you're going to be using a different color paint or ink. Use some Elmer's glue to attach the craft foam to the cardboard or foam board. And you don't need very much. If you use too much, it'll take too long to dry and then you have to wait a lot longer. So if you don't want to wait, then use less glue. And I'm just going to keep gluing all of the different circles onto that cardboard. And once they're all glued, you'll need to let them dry for probably about 5 or 10 minutes. And now I'm actually going to trim my cardboard just because I have a little extra cardboard I don't really need on there, so I'm going to trim it off. And I'll let that dry for a few minutes. You might want to add your name on the back just in case somebody has a similar pattern or texture as you. We're going to save all of the craft foam, so even if it looks like a tiny little scrap, you're going to save it. Next, you get to choose your color of felt, and you need to fold the felt in half the hamburger way. So it should be folded in half and about the size of a sheet of paper. And when you fold it in half, it'll be like you folded a piece of paper in half. And then you need to find a cardboard pattern that's the most similar to your design plan. So your design plan might look a little different than the pattern, but that's okay. You need to pick a pattern that matches your design closely or a pattern that you like. Put it on top of the folded felt and you're going to cut around the pattern. It's okay if it's a little bit off. This is just going to be used as a reference. And I actually realized it was kind of tricky to cut inside this groove there, so I actually ended up cutting all the way across and then I took the pattern off and cut out that groove. So my monster will have some square ears. Or they could be legs too if you flipped it the other way. Now you want to save all of your extra felt scraps. So we'll save those, save the patterns because we're going to use those. All classes will use those. Now when you open up your felt, it might look kind of funny to you. The reason why it's doubled up is because we need a front and a back for our monster. So if you don't fold the felt, that's where you're going to run into trouble and you only get one piece of felt. So don't waste it. Use it very wisely, use it carefully. So save your felt. Then you can take your stamp if it's dry and you'll dip it into some paint or ink. And you don't need to press very hard. And then you're actually going to stamp it right on top of the felt. Now this paint is permanent, the ink is permanent, so make sure that you are very careful and you don't get any on your clothes because it will stain. Also be careful where you put the stamp when you stamp it onto your felt because if you didn't want ink or paint somewhere, you can't wash it off of the felt. Once it's on there, it's going to stay on there. And I'm just turning my stamp in different directions to kind of give it a variety of different polka dots. And you can use any color that you would like. If you have a blue piece of felt, you might want to use a different color of paint. Like I'm not using the red violet color, I'm just using a lime green on the red violet. And these are actually complementary colors. So they have a high contrast. If you want a high contrast, then you use complementary colors. Those are colors across from each other on the color wheel. And there we are. Now you need to put your name on some tape and stick it onto the felt, and then you'll put it on the drying rack to dry until next class. Now we're going to learn how to thread the needle and tie a knot, and this is the basics of sewing. You'll see that I took the tape off that I used before just to keep it out of the way. You'll put it back on so you can save the tape for when you're finished. I'm going to fold my felt in half. And your paint and ink should be dry now. And I'm going to figure out where I need to sew. So I have a folded edge on one side, so that side I don't actually have to sew on. I could, but I don't have to. And I'm going to figure out that on the bottom, that's where I want to put my stuffing. Now before we start sewing, we need to learn how to thread a needle and tie a knot into the thread. The thread that we're using is a crochet thread, and this is a needle threader, so it's a little wire device used to help you thread the needle, and then you have a needle. So you'll first need about 2 feet to 3 feet of crochet thread. You don't need a lot. If you have too much, it's going to be way too hard to sew. If you don't have enough, then you're going to have to stop halfway through, and it's just kind of a mess when you have to stop over and over again. So use about 2 to 3 feet tops. Now for tying the knot, there's a few different ways you can do it. It's kind of like if you were tying your shoelaces or double knotting your shoelaces. So I'm basically just making a simple knot one at a time. So I have a very small knot, you can barely see it, and I'm going to do the same thing and try and line it up with that knot, and sometimes it doesn't line up, and that's okay. And as I keep tying, that knot is going to get larger and larger. We want to tie probably about 3 or 4 times to make a large enough knot. If the knot isn't big enough, then it's just going to pull right through the felt. Now we're going to learn how to thread the needle. And one way you can do that is, it might sound gross, but you lick the end of your thread just a little bit, and you're going to attempt to put it into the eye of the needle. Now for me, this is kind of tricky because I don't have the greatest eyes. So if you have good eyes, you might be able to do this no problem. You also have to have very steady hands. Another way you can thread the needle is to use a needle threader, and this way is much faster in my opinion. So your needle threader has a little wire end, a diamond shape at the end, and you're going to just put that through the eye of the needle. That's the opening of the needle. It's called the eye. And then you're going to take your thread, the thread that you already have cut, and you'll put that right through the diamond shape of the needle threader. And once the thread is through the diamond shape of the needle threader, then you're going to hold on to the needle and pull the needle threader back. So back out. And it might be a little tricky at first, but it'll pull your thread right through the eye of the needle. Keep pulling until the shorter end of the thread is off, and then you can just gently pull the needle threader away. And now your needle is threaded, and it didn't take very long at all. Now you'll notice that you have a long end and a short end. So you should have a short end of your thread and then a long end. And on the long end, that should be the end that has the knot. Now, there's kind of a secret to holding your needle. You need to make sure that you hold both threads, so the short thread and the long thread, between your fingers. If you don't hold it together, then it's just going to slip out and you have to re-thread the needle again. It's just kind of a pain. Now I'm deciding where I want to start sewing. I want to add my stuffing into the bottom, so we're going to start sewing it, and I'm going to start sewing at the top. I don't have to sew the folded edge because it's already folded. I don't have to sew it together, so I'm just going to start at the top near one of those square ears, and I'm going to start from the bottom. So I'm going to make sure that I got both pieces of felt, and I'm going to pull all the way through. I'm holding both threads, and it'll stop when the knot is stuck at the back of your felt. Now we're using a whip stitch, and a whip stitch is a very easy beginner level stitch. It goes very fast, it doesn't take much time. So I went through the bottom of my fabric, so you'll always remember that you need to take your needle and go from the bottom and then up, and then the bottom and then up. So you'll see I'm pulling it up through the bottom again. When you start, it might be kind of tricky. You might find that you have a few mistakes, or maybe you didn't line up the felt enough. If you have to, you can always take your thread out. You can always start over. So it's sometimes it's frustrating and you might just need to take a break, and that is totally understandable. When I started learning sewing, it took a long time before I felt confident, before I felt like I could do something without making a mistake. I made mistakes a lot, and it's okay if you make a mistake. It's all right. So I just keep going from the bottom up. So my thread came through the top, then I put my needle through the bottom again. We just keep going along doing that. You want your stitches to be about a 1/4 inch or less apart. If they're too far apart, your stuffing is going to come out and it's not going to look very nice. Now, you might be in the middle of sewing and realize that it's almost the end of class and you're not done. So if you need to stop for the day, all you have to do is just take your needle off of the thread and put the needle back because other classes are using them. Leave your thread just like that, and you'll want to make sure you put your name back onto your project. So you put your name on the piece of tape and put it back onto your felt and then put it away for the day. And the next class you just have to rethread the needle and you can keep sewing. Now I'm going to continue sewing, and I'm almost finished with the sewing. I need to rethread my needle, so I'm taking my needle threader, I'm putting the diamond shape through the eye of the needle. I'm going to put my thread through the diamond shape of the needle threader. And then pull the needle threader holding the needle at the same time. And that will thread my needle. So remember, you have a long end and a short end. The long end should be attached to your project. The short end, it should just be hanging free. And you need to make sure that you hold both ends when you're sewing. So we're going to keep going from the bottom. So we put the needle in through the bottom and then pull it up until it's at the top. And then we put it into the bottom again. And we're just going to continue to do that until we get to where we need to stop. You need to leave an opening so you can put stuffing inside. If you sewed the entire thing shut, then you can't put the stuffing inside, which is kind of a bummer. If you want it to be a soft sculpture, it needs to have stuffing. So before we add the stuffing, we need to add a knot when we're finished sewing. So I'm finished sewing that part. I'm going to leave the bottom open so I can put the stuffing inside. And to make a knot, you need to actually just pretend you're making a stitch, but instead of pulling all the way through, you'll stop and you'll notice that now you have a loop. And the loop it's actually kind of fun. You put the needle through the loop and then you can pull it like a regular stitch. Now you have to do this more than once. So if you really want to be sure, you can do it 4 times. I do it twice just because that makes a good knot. So I have my loop again, and I'm going to put my needle through the loop and then pull the needle straight up, and now I have a nice secure knot and it's not going to come loose. If you do not do this part, you are not going to have a secure thread and it's probably just going to fall apart. Next, we have our stuffing, and the stuffing comes in all different colors and it pulls right apart, kind of like cotton candy. And you're going to want to start with small pieces, especially if you have ears or smaller places where you need to get the stuffing inside. Now, you might notice it's kind of hard to get the stuffing into smaller places, so you can use a pencil if you need to, and use the pencil to kind of push the stuffing into the smaller areas. So like my ear, I need to push it up into the ear. You don't want too much stuffing that the thread ends up stretching or you end up having stuffing coming out of the seams. You don't need that much stuffing, really. So now I'm going to use my pencil again and put some stuffing in the other ear. And then I'm going to keep adding stuffing to the whole body. And it's good to break the stuffing up into smaller pieces. That way you can adjust it a little more and it's not going to look very lumpy. Now, once it's about an inch or so away from the outside, so from the opening where you're putting the stuffing, then you know it's probably ready to be sewed shut. So now I think I'm about ready. If you have too much stuffing, it's just going to be way too hard to sew it shut and you'll have to take some stuffing out. So now I am almost done with the sewing. I just need to rethread my needle and tie a knot in the bottom of the thread. So just a quick review on the tying of the knot. Remember that you're going to tie it once and then you might need to tie it again, at least probably 3 or 4 times. And if you know a different way, you can use that way as long as it creates a secure knot. That is all that really matters. You could also use some other things like tape. If you really need to, you can use tape to secure it. You'll want to add a knot eventually. And now I'm using my needle threader to thread the needle once again. You don't have to use a needle threader, you can just do it manually, but it's a little easier when you have a needle threader just because this thread is a little thicker. All right, I'm going to start on one side of the opening of my monster. And make sure that you are holding both the short end of the thread and the long end. So hold on to it tightly. Otherwise, if you don't hold on to it, then your thread's just going to slip right through your fingers and you have to rethread the needle all over again. So I'm starting on one side and I'm just going to do the same whip stitch like we did before. And if you ever notice that your thread gets caught or tangled, you can always kind of pull it out, or you can always pull the needle off of the thread and rethread it if you need to. Remember, you can always fix mistakes when you're sewing. That's the good news, especially when you're hand sewing. You can always take your thread out and start over. You can always do something differently and learn from your mistakes, so it's okay if you make a mistake. Now, the last part of this is that you need to add that knot again. So like when we added the knot before, you're going to need to add the knot at the end to make sure that the thread stays secure. If you don't add the knot, then your threads are just going to come right out, and it's a huge bummer. So I'm almost done. So now I'm adding the knot, so I'm pretending that I'm making my same stitch, but then I'm going to not go all the way, and I'm going to find the loop, put my needle through the loop, hold the needle, and pull all the way up. And then I'm going to do it again. So at least twice. You can do this 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times if you really want to make sure it's really secure. I just do it twice. That's all I really need to do to make a nice knot. And then you can cut off that extra thread and you have it all sewn up and you're done with the sewing. You can trim any other threads too. Now comes the even more fun part. This is the adding details part. There's a couple different ways you can do things. You can have a lot of freedom with how you want your monster to look. If you want it to have hair or wings, arms. I'm doing a simple way to make hair. So I just wound a bunch of yarn around my hands or my fingers, and now I have a big roll of yarn. And I'm going to take a small piece of yarn, and I'm going to put it through the middle of that wound up yarn, and I'm going to tie it all together so it doesn't move. And this is a really nice way for making hair. And you can use any color you want. You can style it differently. Now, it doesn't look quite like hair just yet. I need to actually cut down the middle of that wound up yarn. So I'm going to cut down the middle, and now I'm going to have locks of hair that will kind of come out. It kind of looks like a mad scientist hairdo. Kind of crazy. And that's good. That's what I want for my monster. And I think it'll go right on top. But before I add that, I want to make sure that I cut out the eye for my monster. So I'm going to use a really big single eye, just one big eye. And you can use any scrap felt or the white felt. You can use any of those for adding eyes, mouth, teeth, ears, arms, legs. There's my eye. And now I need to go to the hot glue gun. The hot glue gun is going to be used to get these things to stick. So I actually added a little bit of red thread to my eyeball to make it look like it had bloodshot eyes. You could also use like a red permanent marker to do that too. Make sure it's permanent though. Crayola markers will not work. So I added some hot glue on there. You have to be very, very careful, especially because it's just gets so hot and it can stick really bad. So be really careful when you're handling the hot glue gun. Now in the middle of my eye, I'm actually going to put a teal colored button to make it look like a pupil of the eye. So you can use buttons and beads, all sorts of things that you would like to add or that you would like to use for details for your monster. And I glued his hair in place, and I think I'm going to stop there for now. I might add a tail or some wings later, but I'm going to stop there. He's got his eyeball and his hair. He's got a face going. Maybe a mouth later, we'll see. But he is pretty much finished.